He laughed. Not a quiet laugh. Not the kind a man swallows when he realizes someone might be listening. Damien Falcone laughed the way men laugh, when they are absolutely certain no one who matters can hear them. Loud, loose, careless. The laugh of a man who stopped being careful about his wife a long time ago. She's the only one still fighting for it, he said, and the men around him found that funny too. Vivian stood 12 feet away, half hidden by a column draped in white orchids, holding a champagne glass she had forgotten to drink from. The ballroom glittered around her. 500 of Manhattan's most powerful people moved through the light in their best clothes, performing their best versions of themselves. And her husband, the man she had shared a bed with for 7 years, the man whose name she had taken, the man she had protected and covered for and quietly, stubbornly loved, was laughing at her. She did not move. She did not cry. She did not make a scene. She smiled at a passing couple she didn't know, nodded like everything was fine, and pressed her thumbnail into her palm hard enough to leave a mark. If you have ever loved someone who didn't know how to love you back, stay with me. Because this story doesn't end where you think it does. Like this video, if you believe a woman's silence is never the same as surrender, drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story has traveled. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because the stories I tell don't arrive gently, and you don't want to walk in halfway through. The charity gala for the Manhattan Children's Education Fund was held the second Friday of every December, and Vivian had attended every single one for the past 6 years. She had organized the seating arrangement for the first 3. She had personally selected the centerpieces for 2 of them. She knew the catering manager's daughter's name and which scholarship recipient had cried during their speech last year, and how many glasses of sparkling water Damien would drink before switching to scotch. She knew everything about that evening because she had made it her job to know everything, the same way she had made it her job to know everything about every event, every dinner, every appearance they made together as a couple. It was not a role she had been asked to fill. It was a role she had constructed for herself, brick by brick, over 7 years, in the specific and quiet way that women build things when they are trying to be worth keeping. That night she was wearing a gown the color of deep water. Not quite navy, not quite black, something in between that shifted when she moved. Her hair was pinned up, a few pieces loose around her face the way Damien had once told her he liked, years ago, before he stopped saying things like that. She had a glass of champagne she'd been carrying for 40 minutes without drinking because she was too busy making sure everything was running the way it was supposed to run. That was the job. Make it look effortless. Make him look devoted. Make the marriage look real enough that no one asked questions about the Falcone name, or what it meant, or where the money actually came from. She was good at it. She had always been good at it. Damien was across the room with Marcus Reyes and 2 other men she recognized as business associates. That word, business, stretching across 1,000 things she had long since stopped asking about. He had his jacket unbuttoned the way he did when he'd relaxed into the evening, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a glass. He looked good. He always looked good. 6 feet of controlled presence, dark eyes that registered everything and gave back nothing. The kind of face that made people want to impress him without quite knowing why. She had loved that face. There were years when she would have crossed a room just to stand close to it. She was heading toward the far side of the space near the silent auction tables. Not toward him, not away from him, just moving the way she always moved at these things, purposefully, with half her attention on logistics and half on keeping her expression pleasant. She passed a column wrapped in white orchids and slowed without planning to. She heard his voice before she heard the words. Damien had a voice that carried, not because he spoke loudly, he almost never did, but because he spoke from somewhere low in his chest, with the easy authority of a man who had never in his adult life had to repeat himself. Even in a crowded ballroom, even with the string quartet playing softly near the windows, she could pick out his voice from 30 feet away. She heard, "Still fighting for it." And then the laughter. She stopped walking. She should have kept moving. She knows that now, in the way you always know things in retrospect, when the knowing doesn't help anymore. She should have turned a degree to the left and found someone to talk to about the auction items or the scholarship announcements or literally anything else. Instead, she stood behind that column, her champagne glass tilted at a slight angle, and she listened. 7 years, Marcus said, something appreciative in his tone, the way men sound when they find something both absurd and impressive. 7 years and she still thinks it means something. Damien's voice, easy, unbothered, like he was talking about a sports team that kept losing. You have to respect the commitment, I guess. More laughter. Vivienne's champagne glass was going to leave marks on her fingers if she held it any tighter. She never asked for much, Marcus said, and there was something in his voice that might have been a warning or might have just been observation, hard to tell with Marcus. That's the problem, Damien said. If she'd been more demanding, it would have been easier to end. The string quartet shifted into something slower. Somewhere to her left, a woman laughed at something her companion said. The world continued moving, indifferent, while Vivienne stood behind a column draped in white orchids and understood, with the specific clarity that only comes from hearing something you cannot unhear, that her husband found her love for him both tiresome and faintly embarrassing. She stood there for 11 seconds. She counted later, approximately, reconstructing the moment from the inside out. Then she straightened her spine, adjusted the angle of her champagne glass, and walked toward the auction tables like nothing had happened. She had met him at 26. She had been working in arts administration at a mid-sized foundation in Midtown, the kind of work that paid modestly and mattered genuinely, surrounded by people who cared about things like access and equity and whether children in under-resourced neighborhoods had instruments to play. She was good at her job in a specific way, not flashy, not self-promoting, but thorough, observant, the kind of person whose departure in organization feels for months. Damien had come to one of the foundation's fundraising dinners because his company, Falcone Capital, respectable on paper, immaculate on paper, everything very clean on paper, had made a significant contribution. He was 30, already carrying the kind of gravity that makes people assume a man has earned something, even when they're not sure what. He had been watching her work the room before he introduced himself. She found out later he'd asked someone who she was. He had a way of deciding on things. Their first real conversation lasted 2 hours and covered bad architecture, a specific argument about the economics of arts funding, and whether people who said they didn't like music were lying to themselves or to others. He was sharp. He was funnier than she expected. He listened in a way that most people at events like that didn't, not waiting for his turn to speak, but actually listening, tracking, following the thread of what she said. She thought, this is a man who pays attention. She was not wrong. She was just wrong about how long it would last, and what kind of attention it would eventually become. They dated for 14 months, and those months were the version of him she still kept somewhere in the back of herself, even now. He was present. He remembered things. He showed up. There were Sunday mornings with bad coffee and good conversation, and the particular kind of contentment that comes from being with someone who feels like a choice you keep making. She knew about the business, in the way you know about things when someone is careful about what they show you. She understood that Falcone Capital's cleanliness on paper did not tell the full story. She was not naive. She had simply decided that people were complicated, that the man she was sitting across from at 10 in the morning was real, even if other parts of his life were not, and that love was not a courtroom where you presented evidence. She married him at 28. For the first 2 years, it was good. Not perfect. She was not a person who trusted perfect, but good in the ways that mattered. He was protective without being controlling, present without being suffocating. She kept her work at the foundation for another year after the wedding, and he supported that genuinely, without making her feel like she was embarrassing him by having a salary that was a fraction of his. Then the threats started. A phone call that came to her personal cell from an unrecognized number. A car that sat outside the foundation office for 2 days. Small things that were not small. Damien had enemies, the way men in his position have enemies, and his enemies had noticed her. She left her job. She didn't fight him on it as hard as she should have. She told herself it was temporary, that she would figure out something else, that she would find another way to do meaningful work. She was not the first woman to say that. The something else never quite materialized in the way she'd planned. There were charity commitments, social obligations, the full-time labor of being the visible, credible, gracious face of the Falcone marriage. She was good at it because she was good at most things she turned her attention to, but good at something and needing something are not the same. She understood that distinction by year 4. By year 5, she had stopped explaining it to herself. By year 6, she had begun to disappear. Not dramatically, not in any way you could point at and name. She was still there. She still showed up. She still smiled in photographs and remembered the names of Damien's associates' children and made sure the apartment looked like a home, even when it felt more like a well-maintained stage set. But something had been going out of her, slowly, the way a room loses warmth when someone forgets to close a window. Not sudden, not catastrophic, just a steady, quiet loss. She was 35 now, and standing behind a column at a charity gala, she understood that the man on the other side of it had noticed the window was open and chosen not to close it. She found the bathroom, a private powder room near the back of the venue, single occupancy, with a lock. She went in, turned the lock, and stood at the sink for a moment with both hands on the cool marble. She looked at herself in the mirror. Her makeup was still perfect, which was both a skill and a kind of sad commentary on the evening. Her eyes were clear. Her color was fine. She looked like a woman who was completely all right, and she found that deeply, specifically terrible. She had cried over Damien before. Not often, she was not a crier, generally, had not been since she was young, but in the early middle years of the marriage, when the distance had first begun to open between them, she had cried privately and thoroughly, the way you cry when you still believe things might be different. She had cried about the dinners he canceled without apology, and the trips he abbreviated without explanation, and the conversations that stopped before they started because he came home too late or left too early or was present in body while somewhere else entirely. She did not cry now. She stood at the sink and looked at her face and thought, "How long have you been fighting for something he dismissed at a dinner party?" The answer came back fast and clear, the way answers come when you've been keeping them at arm's length for too long. Years. Not weeks. Not months. Years. She had fought in the specific, quiet, exhausting way that women fight when they don't want to be accused of being difficult. By being more understanding, more patient, more gracious, more willing to interpret silence as thoughtfulness and distance as stress and neglect as a form of love she hadn't yet learned to read. She had translated his absences into meanings they didn't carry. She had done years of unpaid interpretive labor on a marriage she was apparently the only one still attending. She straightened up, adjusted one of the small pins in her hair, opened the door, and walked back out into the ballroom. She found her table easily. They were seated at table 4, which was where the Falcone name always landed them. Close enough to the front to signal importance, far enough from the podium that Damien didn't have to make small talk with the organizers during the speeches. Damien was already seated when she arrived. He had saved her chair, in the sense that her chair existed and no one else was sitting in it. He didn't look up immediately when she sat down. "There you are," he said, eyes scanning the room. "Here I am," she said. She unfolded her napkin. She placed it across her lap. She accepted a glass of water from the server who appeared at her elbow. He glanced at her then. A brief, efficient glance of the kind that takes inventory without really looking. "You okay? You were gone a while." "I was checking on a few things with the event staff." "Everything handled?" "Yes." He nodded, satisfied, and returned his attention to the room. This was one of the things she had once found reassuring about him. His confidence that if she said something was handled, it was handled. His trust in her competence. She had mistaken that trust for intimacy for a long time. The dinner proceeded. The speeches happened. The scholarship recipient, a 17-year-old from the Bronx named Amara, who was going to study architecture, spoke with a directness and a composure that made Vivian's chest hurt in a specific, clarifying way. She watched this girl stand at a microphone and talk about the future she was building, and she felt something shift very slightly in her chest, something small and tectonic. Afterward, when the dancing began and the evening loosened into its social second half, Damien was called away by Marcus for a conversation that required stepping out to the terrace. He touched her shoulder lightly as he passed, a gesture of acknowledgement or habit, and she watched him go. She sat for a moment. Then she put her napkin on the table and went to find Amara. The girl was near the edge of the room, talking to one of the foundation staff, still holding the small crystal award she'd been given. Up close, she was younger looking than she'd been at the podium, nervous energy visible now that she wasn't performing, eyes moving a little too quickly. "That was a remarkable speech," Vivian said. Amara looked at her with the careful assessment of a teenager who has learned to parse which adults mean what they say. "Thank you." "The part about structures," Vivian said, "about how you know a building is sound, not by whether it looks finished, but by whether it would survive stress." Where did that come from? Something relaxed in the girl's face. My grandfather. He worked construction for 40 years. He used to say the pretty ones fall first. Vivian held her gaze. He was right. They talked for 11 minutes. About architecture and about the Bronx and about what it felt like to want something specific enough that you'd change the trajectory of your whole life toward it. Vivian listened the way she used to listen, before she'd spent so many years in rooms where listening was strategic rather than genuine. When she walked back toward table 4, she felt slightly different than she had an hour ago. Not better, exactly. Not healed, not resolved, not any of the clean things. Just clearer. Like a window someone had actually wiped. Damien was back at the table. He watched her approach. Who were you talking to? He asked. The scholarship recipient, Amara. A beat. The kid from the speech? Yes. He processed that. That was a good speech, he said, his tone suggesting this surprised him slightly. It was an honest speech, Vivian said, and sat down. He looked at her for a second, something registering in his expression that she couldn't quite read. Then someone at the next table said his name, and his attention moved. She picked up her champagne glass. This time she drank from it. She had a decision to make. Not tonight. Tonight was still a performance, and she was too good at performances to abandon one midway. But tomorrow, and the day after, something would need to change. Not because she had run out of love, but because she had run out of the particular kind of hope that makes a person keep trying to win something the other person had already decided wasn't worth having. She was not going to file for divorce. She was not going to make a scene or deliver an ultimatum or do any of the dramatic things that people did in stories about marriages like this. She was going to do something far more disorienting for a man like Damien Falcone. She was going to stop trying, stop performing, stop translating his silences into meanings they didn't carry. Stop measuring her days by whether he came home and how he looked at her and what it might mean if he did or didn't. She was going to take the energy she had spent on a marriage she was apparently fighting alone, and she was going to give it back to herself. She didn't know yet what that would look like. She had been out of practice for a long time, but she thought about Amara and her grandfather and a building that survives stress, and she thought, start with what's true. Start with what holds. She set her champagne glass down. She smiled at the couple across the table who had said something she'd missed. She sat in the ballroom of the Manhattan Cartwright Hotel for another hour, in a gown the color of deep water, beside a husband who didn't know her anymore, and she was already somewhere else entirely. She went to bed before he came home that night, not as a statement, not to make him notice the empty side of the room when he finally got in. She went to bed because she was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. The particular exhaustion of a woman who has been performing composure for 4 consecutive hours while something inside her quietly came apart, and because she had spent enough of her life timing her sleep around another person's schedule. She was not asleep when he came in. She heard the elevator, heard the quiet movement of him through the apartment, heard water run briefly in the bathroom. She lay on her side facing the window and watched the lights of the city and kept her breathing even. He got into bed without saying anything. She didn't say anything either. In the old days, the early years, even the middle years, she would have. She would have turned over, would have said something small and real in the dark, the kind of low-volume honesty that only happens between 2 people at the end of a day when the performances are finally down. She had liked that part of marriage, specifically, the part after everything. She didn't turn over. She heard his breathing slow after about 20 minutes. Then she lay there for another hour, looking at the lights, thinking about nothing in particular and everything at once. In the morning, she was up before 6. She made coffee because she needed coffee, not because she was waiting for him. She sat at the kitchen island with a mug and her phone and a small legal pad she used for lists, and she thought about what a person does when they decide to stop. The thing about stopping was that it couldn't be dramatic. If she stopped loudly, if she withdrew in ways he could see and interpret and respond to, it would become about him, about his reaction, about whether he noticed or whether he asked or whether he did the things she had been waiting for him to do for years. And she was finished letting his behavior set the terms of her experience. So she made a list. It was not a list about Damien, it was a list about herself, about the things she used to do before she became the curator of someone else's life. She wrote down the bookstore on Clarkson Street. She had passed it dozens of times over the years, had stopped in twice, had noticed a handwritten sign in the window about weekend volunteers for a children's reading program. She had meant to look into it. That was 2 years ago. She wrote it down. She wrote down other things. A ceramics class she'd seen advertised at the community center 6 blocks from the apartment. A friend named Delia, who she had let go quiet over the past 3 years. Slowly, the way you let go of things that require energy, you keep redirecting elsewhere. She was halfway through her second cup of coffee when Damien came into the kitchen. He was already dressed, which meant he had somewhere to be before 9 on a Saturday, which was not unusual, which she had long since stopped asking about. He went to the coffee maker, poured himself a cup, and stood at the counter looking at his phone. "Late night," he said. It wasn't an apology and it wasn't an explanation. It was just a statement dropped into the room. She said. He looked up. Read her face the way he always did. Quick, efficient, cataloging rather than seeing. "You sleep okay?" "Fine." A pause. He drank his coffee. She made a small addition to her list. "I have a thing this morning," he said. "Probably until 2:30. Okay?" He waited, she realized afterward. A beat that was slightly longer than it needed to be. The kind of pause where previously she would have asked what the thing was, or said something about lunch, or made some small move to close the distance between them. She had always been the one to close the distance. She had become so practiced at it that she'd done it reflexively, the way you catch yourself before you fall, without even deciding to. She looked at her list. "I'll be out this morning too," she said. Another pause, different quality. "Oh yeah? Where?" "There's a reading program at a bookstore on Clarkson. I want to check it out." He processed that. His face didn't change much, it rarely did, but she had spent 7 years reading the small adjustments, a fractional narrowing of the eyes. "Since when?" "Since this morning," she said, which was true. He drank his coffee. "All right." He picked up his phone again. "Text me if you need anything." She didn't answer that because it was the kind of thing people said when they had run out of things to actually say, and she was tired of responding to noise as though it were signal. He left at 8:42. She finished her list. The bookstore was called Clarkson & Co., which was not a clever name but was an honest one. It had been owned by the same family for 31 years, a narrow 2-story space on a block that had changed around it while it stubbornly remained itself. The shelves were overcrowded in the way that communicated love rather than negligence. The floors creaked. It smelled like paper and coffee, and something faintly lemon-based that she identified later as wood polish. A woman named Ruth ran the Saturday reading program. She was in her mid-60s, compact and direct, with reading glasses on a chain and the kind of voice that didn't need to be loud to fill a room. She had Vivian fill out a brief volunteer form, asked her 2 questions. Had she worked with children before? Did she have a preference for age group? And put her in the back room with 7 kids between the ages of 6 and 9. No orientation, no lengthy explanation. Just, they're waiting for someone to read to them. The books are on the cart. Vivian stood in the doorway for half a second, looking at 7 small humans sitting on a rug, looking back at her with a mixture of anticipation and absolute indifference to who she was or where she came from, and she felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for longer than she could accurately remember. She picked up a book from the cart. She sat down in the low chair at the front of the rug. "Hi," she said. "Hi," said a few of them. A boy in the front row, maybe 7, with a gap where his 2 front teeth should have been, said, "Are you going to do the voices?" "Depends on the book," she said. He seemed to find this acceptable. She read for 90 minutes. She did the voices. She came back the following Saturday, and the one after that. By the 3rd weekend, Ruth had given her her own group, the older kids, 9 to 12, the ones who read well enough to argue about what they'd read, which was Vivian's particular favorite kind of conversation. By the 4th weekend, she was arriving 20 minutes early to set up and staying half an hour late to help reshelve. She didn't tell Damien much about it, not because she was hiding it, but because he didn't ask, and she had stopped volunteering information into silences that weren't really asking for anything. He noticed the schedule change eventually, the way he noticed most things, slowly, from the periphery, once the change had become established enough that its absence would have been more visible than its presence. One Sunday evening at the end of November, he came home at 6:30 to an apartment that was clean but did not have dinner in progress, and Vivian sitting at the kitchen table reading a book she'd borrowed from the Clarkson and Cobie shelves, and he stood in the hallway for a moment in a way that telegraphed something had been subtly rearranged. "Did you eat?" he asked. "I had something earlier," she said without looking up from the page. "There's stuff in the fridge if you want." A long pause. "You usually—" "I was hungry at 5, she said. "I ate at 5. She turned a page. He went to the kitchen. She heard the refrigerator open, heard the particular sounds of a man who is accustomed to meals appearing, figuring out how to assemble one from components. She did not go help him. She sat with her book and read 2 more pages, not entirely absorbing them, and did not go help him. This was, she understood, the smallest possible act of reclamation. It was almost laughably small. But small was where you started, when you had forgotten what your own preferences felt like. She ate when she was hungry. She went where she wanted to go on Saturday mornings. She called Delia one Tuesday afternoon, and they talked for 2 hours about nothing important and everything real. And Vivian sat on the window seat in the study, watching the city, and laughed 3 times, genuinely, in a way that felt like using a muscle she'd let atrophy. Damien orbited her increasing self-containment with a wariness he wouldn't have named and probably didn't fully recognize. He came home earlier twice in the same week, a change so uncharacteristic that she noticed it the way you notice a change in the weather before you're sure the change is real. He asked her once about the bookstore, a vague and slightly awkward question about what exactly happened there, and she described it plainly. The kids, the books, Ruth's organizational chaos, the specific and unpredictable things children said when a story surprised them. He listened. He said, "That sounds like a lot of your time." "Yes," she said, "it is." He waited for more. She didn't give him more. The distance between them, which had previously been a thing she was constantly, anxiously trying to cross, had stopped moving. She had stepped back from the edge of it. She was not throwing herself into it. She was simply standing somewhere else now, occupying different ground. And the distance was the same distance, but it felt different when you stopped running toward it. She didn't know yet if he felt that. She suspected he was beginning to. The first real argument happened on a Wednesday in early December, 11 days before the snowstorm that would change things further. She had agreed months earlier to attend a dinner at the home of one of Damien's associates, a man named Corbin Voss, whose wife Geneva threw elaborate dinners that were partly social and partly strategic, the kind of evenings where the conversation was always about something other than what it appeared to be about. Vivian had attended a dozen of these dinners over the years. She was good at them. She canceled. She called Geneva the afternoon of, told her she wasn't feeling well, expressed genuine-sounding regret, and meant none of it. She hadn't been planning to cancel. She decided approximately 40 minutes before the dinner, standing in the closet in a dress she'd laid out earlier, looking at herself in the full-length mirror and thinking, "I do not want to go to this dinner. I do not want to sit at that table and perform that particular version of myself for 4 hours. I am not sick. I am not injured. I simply do not want to go." She had spent so many years going anyway. She put the dress back. She changed into jeans and a sweater. She went to the kitchen and made herself pasta, badly, which she ate at the kitchen island while reading the book she'd borrowed from Clarkson and Company. Damien called at 7:15 from Voss's address, presumably when he noticed the absence of his wife and realized her not being there required explanation. "Where are you?" "Home," she said. A beat so compressed it was almost an absence of sound. "Geneva said you were sick." "I'm not sick." "Then what?" "I didn't want to go," she said. The pasta was slightly overcooked. She'd eaten worse. The silence on the other end of the line was a specific kind. The silence of a man recalibrating, whose first instinct was control and whose second instinct was caution, because he understood, without having fully articulated it yet, that something had changed in the architecture of his home, and he didn't yet know how load-bearing those changes were. "Vivienne." His voice had dropped into the register he used when he wanted someone to understand they were approaching a limit. "Voss is important." "To you," she said. "To us." She set her fork down. "I don't think that's true, Damien. I need you here. I know." She kept her voice level. Not cold. She wasn't performing coldness. She found it exhausting and stupid. Just even. You've always needed me in the room. I've been in the room for 7 years. Tonight I'm at home. This is not the time. It really isn't, she agreed. You should go back to dinner. Tell Geneva I'm sorry. She hung up. Her hand was steady. She picked up her fork. She finished the pasta. He came home at 10:30, earlier than she'd expected, and she was in bed reading when she heard him come through the apartment with an energy that was different from his usual contained arrival. Something tightly held, something looking for where to land. He pushed open the bedroom door. She looked up from her book. You want to tell me what that was about? He said. I told you what it was about. Hanging up on me in the middle of... I didn't hang up on you in the middle of anything. I said what I had to say and ended the call. He stood in the doorway looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face in a long time. Not anger exactly, something adjacent to it, something that included confusion, which was not a thing Damien Falcone wore often or comfortably. You've never done that. I know, she said. The words landed in the room and sat there. He stared at her. She held his gaze without flinching, which she'd always been able to do. She had never been afraid of Damien, specifically, which was one of the things that had distinguished her from most people in his life. Something is going on with you, he said. Yes, she said. He waited for her to explain it. She didn't. Are you going to tell me? Not tonight, she said. I'm tired. I'd like to read. She looked back down at her book. She heard him stand in the doorway for another 5 seconds. She counted them without meaning to, and then he moved away, and she heard him go to the kitchen, heard water running, heard the low sound of movement through the apartment. She read 3 more pages without absorbing a word. Then she set the book on the nightstand, turned off the light, and lay in the dark with her eyes open, and did not cry, and did not reconsider, and did not wonder if she had gone too far. She did not think she had gone too far. She thought, for the first time in years, that she had not gone nearly far enough. Check. The snowstorm arrived on a Thursday, fast and mean, the kind of December weather that the city handles with grim competence. The plows out within hours, the subway running on modified service, people bending into the wind on their commutes with their chins down and their jaws set. By Friday morning, 14 inches covered everything. Schools closed. The mayor made a statement. The city quieted into that particular muffled stillness that only happens after heavy snow. Vivian had a commitment at Clarkson & Coto. Ruth had called the previous evening, before the storm hit in full. The reading program was moving forward on Saturday, modified. A few of the regulars wouldn't make it in, but several of the families who lived within walking distance were counting on the bookstore being open because some of those families use Saturday mornings at Clarkson & Company as one of the few structured, heated, safe spaces available to them during the week, and a snowstorm wasn't actually going to change that reality. I'll be there, Vivian said. She left the apartment at 8:30 Saturday morning in her heaviest coat and boots she hadn't worn since she'd given up a version of herself that walked in weather. The doorman offered to call her a car. She thanked him and said she'd walk. She walked 6 blocks through the snow, which was still coming down lightly, the city bone quiet around her, and felt something she hadn't felt in months, possibly years. Present. Just present. Just cold air and wet snow and her own breath, and the particular solidity of her own body moving through weather towards somewhere she actually wanted to be. She arrived at the bookstore pink-cheeked and slightly breathless. Ruth handed her coffee before she'd gotten her coat off. 9 kids came in that morning, brought by parents or older siblings, snow-crusted and noisy, and immediately too much for the confined space. Vivian organized them with the practiced efficiency she'd developed over the past 2 months. Not the polished efficiency of event management, but something more instinctive, more genuinely responsive, and they settled into reading groups with the low-grade reluctance that meant they'd be fully absorbed within 10 minutes. She was reading aloud to the 6 to 8 group, doing the voices, when the bell above the bookstore door announced someone entering. She didn't look up immediately. Ruth handled arrivals. Then she heard Ruth say, in a tone she'd never heard Ruth use, which was a tone of very controlled surprise, "Can I help you?" And then a voice she knew, that low chest register voice that carried without effort, "I'm looking for my wife." She looked up. Damien stood in the doorway of Clarkson & Co., in his heaviest coat, snow across his shoulders, looking at her across a room full of children and paperbacks and string lights someone had put up along the shelves in early December. He looked, And this was the part she would replay later, more than once. He looked uncertain. Not lost. Damien Falcone was never lost. But uncertain in the specific way of a man who has arrived somewhere he didn't have a map for. He had never come to Clarkson and Company before. She hadn't asked him to. He hadn't offered. She was aware of 9 children looking between her and the large, unfamiliar man in the doorway, with the focused interest of people for whom adults were primarily sources of entertainment or danger. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he said. A boy from the 6 to 8 group, Marcus, 7 years old, opinions about everything, said, "Are you her husband?" Damien looked at him. Something crossed his face that she couldn't fully read. A flinching, almost. "Yeah," he said. "I am." "She does the voices really good," Marcus said, as though this was relevant information a husband should have. Damien looked at her then. Just looked at her, standing in front of 9 snow-damp children in a bookstore that smelled like paper and wood polish and old coffee, holding a copy of a book she'd read 4 times in the past 2 months. She was not wearing anything remarkable. Her hair was down, damp at the edges from the snow she'd walked through. She had ink on her right hand from helping a 10-year-old trace letters earlier. He looked at her like he was seeing something he didn't recognize. "I know," he said, very quietly. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at the children. "Okay," she said. "Where were we?" They found their place in the story. She read. Damien sat in a chair near the door. Ruth had produced a chair without being asked, which told Vivian that Ruth was reading the room with characteristic precision. And he stayed for the rest of the morning, not speaking, not interfering, just present in a way he hadn't been in any room she'd occupied for a very long time. She didn't know what it meant yet. She was not going to decide what it meant before she had evidence. But when the last child had left and Ruth was locking the front door and Vivian was pulling on her coat, Damien moved to help her without thinking, his hands finding the collar of her coat with the muscle memory of intimacy, and she stood still and let him, and neither of them said anything. Outside, the snow had stopped. The street was white and muffled and still. "There's something I need to tell you," he said. She looked at him. His face was doing that uncertain thing again, that thing she had not seen on it before the last 2 weeks, and was only now beginning to understand was not a performance. "Not here," she said. "Not yet." He nodded. She could see him accept that, and she could see that accepting it cost him something, and she felt, not satisfaction, that would have been wrong, but a specific, clear recognition that the ground between them had shifted in a way that was not reversible. They walked back through the snow toward the apartment together, not touching, not talking. That evening, she found the journal. Not her journal. She had journals, small notebooks she'd kept intermittently throughout the marriage, not as therapy and not as documentation, just as the private practice of a person who thought better in writing and needed a place that was entirely her own. She had them in the drawer of the nightstand on her side of the bed, where they had always been. But that evening she had gone looking for a pen she'd left in Damien's nightstand drawer. She'd borrowed it weeks ago and forgotten to return it. And when she opened the drawer, she found, underneath his phone charger, and the 2 items that were always there, an object that shouldn't have been there. It was one of her journals. Not a recent one. An older one, the notebook with the water-damaged corner from a trip they'd taken, years ago, to the coast of Maine. She had brought it to write in and had left it in the car one night during rain. She knew what was in it. She remembered writing it. She also knew exactly what it meant that it was in his nightstand drawer, which was not where she kept her journals, which meant he had taken it out at some point and read it, and then kept it rather than returning it. She stood there holding it for a long moment. She opened it to a random page, though she remembered which pages said what, and her eyes found the line she already knew was there, the line she had written on a Tuesday in February 3 years ago after a dinner where he had looked through her for 4 hours. Loving someone should not require disappearing piece by piece. She closed the journal. She sat on the edge of the bed. She was not angry, which surprised her. She was something more complicated than angry. A layered thing, part grief and part recognition, and part something that might, if she wasn't careful, become hope, which she did not trust yet and was not ready for. He had read it. He had kept it. He had carried it into this room, into the drawer beside the bed where he slept, and had kept it there without saying anything to her about what he'd found. She did not know what that meant about who he was becoming. She knew what it meant about who she was. She placed the journal carefully on top of his nightstand, where he would see it when he came to bed. Then she walked out of the bedroom and made tea and stood at the kitchen window watching the snow-covered city and waited for the sound of the elevator that would tell her he was home, with no idea what she would say when she heard it, and no intention of making it easier for either of them. The elevator arrived at 9:53. She heard the doors open down the hall, heard his footsteps, unhurried even, the walk of a man who controlled his pace the way he controlled most things. And she stood at the kitchen window with her tea going cold in her hands and did not turn around. She heard him stop in the hallway, the small sounds of a man removing his coat, hanging it up, the sound of his shoes, then his footsteps again, moving through the apartment toward the bedroom, and then stopping. She counted to 7. Then she heard him come back. He appeared in the kitchen doorway. She turned then, because she was not going to have this conversation with her back to him. He was holding the journal. He held it the way you hold something you're not sure you have the right to be holding, carefully, with an awareness of its weight that had nothing to do with how much it actually weighed. His face was doing something she had no category for. Damien Falcone had approximately 4 facial expressions she had learned to read with accuracy over 7 years, and what was on his face right now was not any of them. "You found it," he said. "It was in your drawer." "I know." "Why?" she said. Not how long, not what did you read. Just the first and most necessary question. Why did you take it? Why did you keep it? Why? He looked at the journal in his hands. He set it on the counter between them, carefully, like setting down something that might break in a direction he couldn't predict. "I found it about 3 months ago," he said. "You'd left it on the nightstand and I picked it up before I realized what it was." "And then you read it?" "Yes." "And then you kept it?" A pause. "Yes." She set her tea down. The sound of the mug hitting the counter was louder than she intended. "Which parts did you read?" "Most of it." His voice was even, but there was a quality underneath the evenness, something taut, something that had been wound up and was holding its own tension. "I read most of it." She looked at him steadily. "So you've known for 3 months." "Known what, specifically?" "That I was unhappy." The word came out plainer than she expected, stripped of the softening she would have reflexively applied even 6 weeks ago. Just the word, just the fact of it. He didn't flinch exactly, but something in his jaw moved. "Yes." "And in 3 months you didn't say anything." "I didn't know how to." She laughed. Not a warm laugh, not a laugh with any humor in it, but the involuntary sound that comes out of a person when the absurdity of something hits before the grief does. "You didn't know how to." "Vivienne, Damien." She said his name the way he sometimes said hers, as a thing that meant stop, or wait, or I need you to hear me. "I wrote that journal while you were sleeping 8 feet away from me. I wrote it in this apartment. I wrote it and left it on surfaces in rooms where you were present, and you found it 3 months ago, and you read it, and you said nothing, and then 2 weeks ago you started coming home early and following me to a bookstore in a snowstorm." She paused. "Help me understand what the 3 months in between were." He was quiet for long enough that she heard the building's heating system cycle on. "I didn't know if you wanted me to," he finally said. "I wanted you to see me." Her voice came out steady. She had not planned it to come out steady. It simply did, because she was past the part of this where her voice broke for him. "I wanted you to know I was there. That's not the same as wanting you to strategize about the timing of an approach." He looked at her. The uncertain thing was on his face again, but layered now with something harder and less comfortable. The expression of a person confronting a version of themselves they had not previously been required to look at directly. "The gala," he said. She went still. "I know you heard me," he said. "That night, with Marcus." The room was very quiet. "How long?" she asked. "Since the drive home. You were different, in a specific way." He stopped. Started again. "I've watched you perform composure for 7 years. I know what it looks like from the inside. That night it was different." She absorbed that. Absorbed the fact that he had known since December, had known she had heard him say she was the only one still fighting for a marriage he no longer believed in, and had said nothing, done nothing, for 2 weeks. Until the snowstorm, until he'd shown up at the bookstore, until she'd left the journal on his nightstand like a door left deliberately open. You laughed, she said. When you said it, all of you laughed. He didn't deny it. She gave him credit for that, a small cold credit, the kind you give when someone does the minimum. I know, he said. What were you going to do? She asked. If I hadn't left the journal, if none of this had happened, were you going to wait until I filed for divorce? Were you going to wait until I was completely gone before you decided I was worth noticing? The question landed between them and didn't move. I don't know, he said, and she believed him, which was somehow worse than if he'd lied. She picked up her tea. It was cold. She drank from it anyway, because she needed something to do with her hands. I need you to leave the kitchen, she said. I need to be in this room by myself for a few minutes. He looked at her. Vivian, I'm not asking for a separation or a divorce or anything dramatic, she said. I'm asking for 15 minutes in this kitchen alone. Can you do that? He picked up the journal. He walked out of the kitchen. She stood alone in the kitchen for a long time, longer than 15 minutes, listening to the city outside the window. And she did not cry, and she did not feel victorious, and she did not feel relieved. She felt the specific, exhausting weight of being seen too late. Sleep that night was thin and fragmented, the kind that leaves you more tired at 6 than you were at midnight. She was up before light, in the kitchen again, and she heard Damien moving in the bedroom. He had not slept well either. She could tell by the frequency of the small sounds, the shifting. And she made coffee and sat with it and tried to think clearly. The problem was this. She had spent 2 months building something. A life, small and new and genuinely hers, with real components. Ruth, the children at Clarkson, Delia's voice on the phone, the particular satisfaction of walking through snow to a place where she was needed in an uncomplicated way. She had built it quietly and carefully, and it had begun to feel solid underfoot. Now Damien was in the room. Not physically, he was still in the bedroom, but in the way that a person's full attention, when you have been starving for it, can occupy every corner of a space even in their absence. She knew this feeling. She had felt it at the beginning, when his attention had been the most extraordinary thing in her life. She knew how it worked on her, specifically. She knew her own susceptibility. She also knew something she hadn't known back then, that his attention, once withdrawn, had taken years from her, had cost her a job she loved, friendships she'd let go quiet, a version of herself she'd had to rebuild from the ground up over 2 months in a bookstore. She was not going to let being seen undo the work of learning to see herself. She heard him come into the kitchen. She looked up. He was in yesterday's clothes, partially. He had not shaved. He looked like a man who had spent the night in an argument with himself, which she suspected was true. He poured coffee. He stood at the counter, not across from her, slightly angled, the posture of someone who understood they had not earned the proximity they wanted. She waited. I need to tell you something, he said, something else. She set down her mug. The night of the gala, he said. What I said to Marcus and the others. He stopped, looked at his coffee. I wasn't talking about not caring. He stopped again, and she watched him work through whatever was blocking the actual sentence, the way you watch someone try to pick up something that keeps slipping. I was performing, he said finally, the same way you perform for those rooms, the way I've performed since I was 22 years old, because in the world I operate in, a man who admits his marriage means something to him is a man who has announced a vulnerability, and vulnerability in my world is an address. She looked at him. That's what you've been doing for 7 years. For most of it, yes. So when you said I was the only one still fighting for it, I was performing certainty I didn't have. His voice was flat with the specific flatness of a man saying a true thing for the first time, which sounds different from lying and different from the truth as it's usually told. I was telling men who would use my hesitation against me that I was in control of every part of my life, including my marriage. It was stupid. It was cowardice. I know that. She sat very still. Damien, if that's true, it's true. If that's true, then you performed indifference to your marriage in front of your associates, and I overheard it, and for 2 months I have been rebuilding myself on the premise that you had simply stopped. She stopped, swallowed. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Yes. Say it back to me. He looked at her directly. You built yourself back on a foundation that I cracked. And the foundation might have been wrong, And I didn't tell you because I didn't know how, and by the time I knew I had to, I was afraid of what you'd already decided. The kitchen was very quiet. She stood up. She walked to the window. She stood with her back to him, looking at the street below. The snow was still there, compressed now at the edges of sidewalks, gray with city use, and she pressed her hand flat against the cold glass. I need you to understand something, she said, without turning around. Even if everything you're telling me is true, even if that night was performance and fear and not an accurate account of how you feel. 2 months ago, I was disappearing. I was disappearing and you watched it happen and you said nothing. The journal you've been keeping in your drawer, I wrote those words while you were in the next room. You read them 3 months ago. The damage was real, even if the cause was more complicated than I understood. She heard him set down his cup. I know, he said, quietly, completely. She turned around. She looked at him across the kitchen. This man she had loved with a completeness that had cost her more than she'd understood at the time. This man who was looking at her now with an unguarded openness she had not seen on his face since the first years. This man who had just told her something true and terrible and necessary. What do you want? She asked. Specifically, not generally, not in the abstract. He didn't hesitate. I want to try. Actually try. Not the performance version, the actual version. That's going to look different from what you think it looks like. I know. It's going to look like Saturday mornings at a bookstore. It's going to look like dinner at 5 if I'm hungry at 5. It's going to look like me having a life that doesn't pause when you walk through the door. Okay? I'm not negotiating those things, Damien. I'm not offering them as conditions that might be revised later. I understand. She looked at him for a long moment. His eyes were steady. Not the strategic steadiness of a man holding a position, but something rawer, something that looked like the actual inside of him. I'm not forgiving you this morning, she said. I'm not asking for this morning. She nodded. She went back to the table. She picked up her coffee. She opened the book she'd left there the night before, the one from Clarkson, and she looked at the page without reading it. After a moment, he sat down across from her at the table. Not close. At the other end, with the length of the table between them. He picked up his coffee. He didn't say anything. They sat in the kitchen while the light changed outside and the city started up below them. And she did not feel resolved, and she did not feel hopeful in any clean way, and she also did not feel alone in the room, and that last part was something she had not felt for so long that she didn't entirely trust it yet. 3 days later, Marcus Reyes came to the apartment. She was on her way out. She had a lunch with Delia, the first time they'd seen each other in person in over 2 years, and she had put on actual clothes for it, a coat she liked, boots that weren't practical but were hers, and she opened the apartment door at 12:15 and found Marcus in the hallway. He was surprised to see her, not unpleasantly. Marcus had always been civil to her in the careful way of a man who respected a perimeter, but surprised, the kind of surprise that told her he had not expected her to be the one to open the door. Vivienne, he said, I didn't know you'd be... I'm leaving, she said. Damien's inside. She moved to pass him. He shifted slightly, not blocking her, not deliberately, but enough that she stopped. She looked at him. Marcus Reyes was 41, broad through the shoulders, with the face of a man who had seen too much to be surprised by most things. She had known him for 6 years, through 100 events and dinners, and the sidelines of conversations she had not been invited to participate in. She had always thought of him as opaque, not unfriendly, but sealed. Right now he looked like he was deciding something. He told you, Marcus said, about the gala. Yes. A pause. What he told you... Marcus stopped. His jaw tightened. Did he tell you all of it? Something cold moved through her, not on her skin, deeper. What part of all of it? She said. Marcus looked down the hallway, looked back at her. I think you should talk to Damien. Marcus. Her voice was level but had an edge she didn't soften. What are you saying to me? He was quiet for long enough that she understood this quiet was a different kind than Damien's, but not uncertainty, but calculation. The calculation of a man who had just said more than he intended and was measuring the cost. There's a woman, he said. Her name is Petra Voss. The hallway was very still. Geneva's sister, he said. It's been... He stopped. It was. It's not. That's... He stopped again and looked at her with the expression of a man who has just handed someone a grenade and realized too late he was still in the room. "How long?" she said. He didn't answer. "Marcus." The edge in her voice had become something else, something that had a sound like calm but was built on nothing calm at all. "How long?" 14 months, he said. "It ended 8 months ago. He ended it." She stood in the doorway of her own apartment looking at this man she had known for 6 years, and she felt the floor of her understanding tip sideways, slowly, like a ship beginning to list. 14 months. 8 months ago it ended, which meant it had run concurrent with years 3 through 5 of their marriage, through the first gradual withdrawal, through the dinners that stopped being warm, through the nights she had lain awake trying to interpret his silences into meanings they could have been carrying, through the journal. Through loving someone should not require disappearing piece by piece. She had been disappearing while he had been somewhere else. "Get out of my hallway," she said. "Vivian, get out of my hallway," she said again. Same volume, same flatness. "Right now." He went. She closed the apartment door. She stood inside the apartment with her back against the door, and her coat on, and her purse on her shoulder, and her lunch with Delia in 45 minutes. And she stood there for a long time looking at the hallway that led to the kitchen, the bedroom, the study, the room she had lived in for 5 years, the room she had filled with the labor of a woman trying to hold something together that had had a hole in it she hadn't known about. She took her coat off. She hung it up. She texted Delia. Something came up. "I'm sorry. Can we reschedule?" She turned her phone face down. Then she walked to the kitchen and sat at the table and waited. Damien came in from his study 7 minutes later. He saw her at the table, coat off, purse still on the chair beside her, hands flat on the table in front of her. And his face changed. He knew. She could see the moment he understood what had happened, not from guilt exactly, but from the specific awareness of a man who has been keeping a door closed and arrived to find it open. His gait slowed. He stopped near the counter. "Vivian, don't," she said, quietly. Precisely. "Don't start with my name." He was still. "Petra Voss," she said, for 14 months, ended 8 months ago. He didn't deny it. She gave him credit for that, the same cold credit as before, a diminishing account. "Yes," he said. The single syllable hit the room like something dropped from a height. "You were going to tell me," she said. "At some point. That was part of the actual try." He was quiet for a moment that was too long. "Yes." "When?" I was trying to—" "When, Damien?" "I don't know," he said. "I was afraid of—" "Stop." She pressed her hands flat on the table. The pressure of her own palms against the wood was grounding, specific, real in a way that nothing in the room felt right now. "You have been sitting at this table for 3 days, letting me believe that the entire problem between us was your emotional withdrawal and your fear of being seen as vulnerable. And there was a woman named Petra Voss. It was over before, while I was disappearing," she said, and her voice cracked on the last word, the first time it had cracked. And she heard it, and so did he. And she did not try to smooth it over or take it back. "You were with someone else while I was sitting in this apartment writing in a journal that you later kept in your nightstand as some kind of—" She stopped. "I can't even—" "I know." His voice was rough. "I know what it looks like." "Do you know what it cost?" She looked at him directly. "Not me. Do you know what it cost me?" He didn't answer, because there was no answer that wasn't insulting. "I want you to go," she said. "Not permanently. I'm not— I need to think. I need you to not be in this apartment while I think, because I cannot think inside the same walls as this conversation right now." He looked at her. He looked like a man at the bottom of something, looking up. "Where do you want me to go?" "I don't care," she said, and meant it with a completeness that surprised even her. "I genuinely do not care. Marcus's, a hotel, the office. I don't care. I need you not to be here." He moved toward her. A step, instinctive, the way a person moves toward someone they have hurt, without thinking about whether they have the right. And she put her hand up, just her hand, flat, between them. He stopped. "One night," she said. "Give me 1 night." He stood there for a moment that felt very long. Then he nodded. He went to the bedroom. She heard the sounds of a bag being packed, the efficient minimum, a man who knew how to leave a place quickly. He had always known how to do that. He passed through the kitchen on his way out. He stopped at the edge of it, not coming in. "I'm not going to ask you to forgive this," he said. "I know what I'm asking you to understand, and I know it's too much, and I'm going to try to earn the right to have this conversation with you, and I know I haven't earned it yet." She looked at him. "That's the most honest thing you've said to me in 5 years," she said. "I need you to understand that what you just said is the most honest thing, and I still need you to leave." He left. She sat at the kitchen table for a very long time. The light outside changed from afternoon to early evening. The city below kept moving, indifferent as ever, which she found neither comforting nor unkind. Just true, just the way things were. She thought about Petra Voss, whose face she had seen at 3 or 4 events over the years. Geneva's younger sister, dark-haired, polished in the Voss family way. She thought about the 14 months. She mapped them against her own memory of those months. What she had been feeling, what she had been interpreting as his stress, his withdrawal, his difficulty with intimacy. All the explanation she had constructed for a behavior that had a simpler and more devastating explanation. She thought about Marcus standing in the hallway saying, "I think you should talk to Damien," which meant Marcus had known, which meant that the dinner she had canceled at the Voss home had been a room full of people who knew something about her marriage that she did not. She had walked out on a dinner. She had sat here eating badly made pasta. And in that house on the other side of the city, people had known. She stood up. She went to the bedroom. She opened her nightstand drawer and she took out the journals. All of them. 3 notebooks. The record of 7 years of a woman trying to understand what was happening to her. And she carried them to the kitchen and set them on the table. She did not open them. She sat with them in front of her and understood, in the specific and non-negotiable way of a woman who has just received the last piece of information she needed, that the woman who had written those journals had been working without the full picture. She had blamed herself for the distance, had wondered, in entries she hadn't reread in months, whether she was demanding enough, present enough, interesting enough, had bent herself into interpretations of his behavior that absolved him while she catalogued her own failures. She had done all of that while he had been with someone else. She picked up the first journal. She opened it to the page she knew, the page he had read, the page she had found him carrying. Loving someone should not require disappearing piece by piece. She read the sentence. Then she closed the journal and set it down and sat in the apartment that was hers as much as his, and she thought about what came next. Not in the way she used to think about what came next, anxious and anticipatory, waiting for his direction, but in the way a woman thinks who has just understood exactly how much she is capable of surviving. She did not know yet what she would decide. She was not going to decide tonight, but she knew something she had not known this morning. She was not the woman who had written those journals anymore. That woman had been trying to hold something together. This woman, sitting alone in the kitchen at the end of a day that had rearranged everything, was going to decide what was worth holding and what she was finally, completely done carrying. She did not sleep that night, not in the fragmented way of the night before. This was different. This was the specific wakefulness of a woman whose body understood that sleep was not available, that the nervous system had received information too large to process in darkness, that the brain was going to work through it, whether she cooperated or not. She lay on the bed fully clothed until 2 in the morning, staring at the ceiling, and then she got up and went to the kitchen and made tea. She didn't drink and stood at the window until the city outside began its gradual pre-dawn lightening. She thought about Petra Voss. She thought about 14 months. She thought about the dinners, the specific ones, the ones she could date now with a new understanding. When Damien had been distracted in a way she had attributed to business, when he had come home with a looseness in his posture that she had read as exhaustion and was now reading as something else entirely. She thought about February of year 4, when he had gone to Chicago for what he said was 3 days and had been gone for 5. And she had not asked because she had learned by then not to ask too many questions about the parts of his life that came toward her in incomplete explanations. She thought about the journal entry from that February. She did not need to reread it. She remembered it almost verbatim. "I'm starting to think I am asking for something that doesn't exist anymore, something that might have been real once and has since become a story. I keep telling myself about our life." She had been right. She had just been wrong about the reason. At 6:15, she called Delia. Delia picked up on the second ring, which meant she had been awake, which meant she had been waiting. "Tell me," Delia said. So Vivian told her. All of it. The journal in the drawer, the conversation in the kitchen, Marcus in the hallway, Petra Voss. 14 months, 8 months ago. It ended. The packed bag and the door closing and the long night on the kitchen table with 3 notebooks in front of her. Delia listened without interrupting, which was one of the things Vivian had always loved about her. When she finished, there was a silence. "What do you need right now?" Delia said. "Not what are you going to do, not what do you feel. What do you need right now?" It was the right question. "I don't know yet," Vivian said. "I think I need to stop sitting in this apartment. Come here. I don't want to be managed." "I'm not going to manage you. I'm going to make actual food and not say anything useful and let you be as miserable as the situation warrants." Vivian was quiet for a moment. "Give me an hour." She showered. She changed. She put on clothes that were hers. Not chosen for an event. Not chosen for how they read in a room. Just a sweater she liked, and jeans, and the boots from the day before. She left her phone on the counter for 4 minutes, then picked it up and put it in her bag because she was not the kind of woman who left her phone behind as a gesture. She was not performing anything for an empty apartment. She left. Delia lived in Brooklyn, a 40-minute subway ride in the honest light of a Saturday morning. Vivian took the train, which she had not done regularly in years. Damien's world operated in cars, in controlled environments, in the particular bubble of insulation that came with a certain level of money and a certain level of threat. And she sat on the orange plastic seat with her hands in her lap and watched the other passengers and felt, underneath the particular awfulness of the morning, something that was almost a relief. She was on a subway. She was going to see her friend. No one in this car knew her name or her husband's name or the specific dimensions of the failure she was carrying. She was just a woman on a train. Delia's apartment was on the 3rd floor of a brownstone on a block with old trees, and it smelled like coffee and the specific mustiness of a person who owned too many books and considered this a point of pride. Delia opened the door and looked at her, just looked, taking inventory the way old friends do, and said nothing, and stepped aside to let her in. They sat at the kitchen table and Delia put food in front of her. Eggs, toast, the kind of breakfast that said, "I know you haven't eaten, not I thought this would help." And Vivian ate most of it without tasting it, and they talked, and they didn't talk. And the morning passed in the way that time passes when you are in the company of someone who knows how to be present without making their presence a performance. At some point, Delia said, "Do you want to stay with him?" Vivian looked at her plate. "I don't know." That's an honest answer. It doesn't feel like one. It feels like a coward's answer. It's not. Delia turned her coffee cup in her hands. Not knowing is not the same as avoiding. You found out yesterday. You're allowed to not know the answer on the following morning. "I've been not knowing for years," Vivian said. "In different ways. I've been not knowing what was wrong, and not knowing what I was feeling, and not knowing how much longer I could do it. I'm tired of not knowing." "So what do you know?" She was quiet for a long time. Outside the window, a branch moved in cold air, and the light through the glass was the thin, flat light of December. "I know that the woman I've been for the past 2 months is someone I want to keep being," she said finally. "The bookstore, the kids, calling you, eating when I'm hungry. I know that I built that and it's mine and I'm not giving it up." "Okay," Delia said. "What else?" "I know that what he did was not an absence of love in the way I understood it. I know it was a different kind of failure. That doesn't make it smaller, but it's a different shape than I thought." "Does the shape matter?" "It matters to what I decide. Yes." Delia nodded. She didn't push. That was the whole of why Vivian had called her. Her phone buzzed at 11:47. She looked at it. "Damien, can we talk today?" She stared at the message for a moment. Then she typed, "Tomorrow morning, the apartment, 9. She put her phone away. Delia looked at her from across the table. "Tomorrow? I need today." "Good," Delia said, and got up to make more coffee. She stayed in Brooklyn until 4. She walked back to the subway in the cold with her hands in her pockets and her chin down against the wind. And she thought about very little on the ride home, which was either progress or a kind of temporary mercy she wasn't going to question. The apartment was exactly as she'd left it. His absence had a quality she hadn't expected. Not emptier than usual, because his presence had not recently been a filling thing, but different in texture, The way a room is different when you know the person who usually occupies it is not coming back soon. She moved through it, turned on lights against the gray afternoon, stood in the bedroom doorway for a moment, looking at the space where he had packed a bag. She noticed, on his nightstand, that the journal was still there, the one she had placed there 2 nights ago. She picked it up. She carried it back to her nightstand. She put it in the drawer with the others. Then she made dinner. Properly this time, not the careless pasta from a week ago, but something that required attention, that gave her hands something to do. And she ate it at the table, and she went to bed at 10, and she slept deeply and without interruption, which told her something about the relationship between resolution and rest. He arrived at 8:58. She heard the elevator, heard his knock. He knocked, which he had never done, which told her he understood this morning required that, and she opened the door. He looked like a man who had not slept in 36 hours, which she suspected was accurate. He was clean. He had showered, changed, but the exhaustion was in his face in a way that no amount of grooming covered. He stood in the doorway with his hands at his sides and waited for her to tell him whether he could come in. She stepped back. He came in. They went to the kitchen. She had made coffee. She poured him a cup because it was a reflex, and she was not going to fight her own reflexes this morning. She had larger decisions to make. He took it and stood at the counter, not sitting, not making himself at home. She sat at the table. "You wanted to talk," she said. He looked at her. He looked like he had been rehearsing this and had decided somewhere between the hotel and the elevator that rehearsing was the wrong approach. "I want to tell you everything, if you'll let me." "Everything," she said. "Petra, how it started, how it ended, all of it. Not because I think it changes what I did, but because—" He stopped. "Because I'm done keeping things in separate rooms and hoping the walls hold." She looked at him steadily. "Then talk." He set down his coffee. He came to the table and sat, not across from her, not at the far end, at the adjacent corner, close enough that she could see his face clearly, far enough that he was not in her space. He talked. It had started, he told her, at a dinner at the Voss home in what she could now place as year 3 of their marriage. Petra had been there visiting her sister, had been seated near him, had been, he chose the word carefully, easy, in the way that people who require nothing from you feel easy when you are exhausted by the weight of everything you are carrying. He was not excusing it, he was describing it. It had continued because he let it, because he made the series of choices that become one larger choice when they are laid in a line and examined. Because he was, he said, a coward in ways he had not understood about himself and had not wanted to understand. It had ended because it was hollow, not because of guilt, though there was guilt. He was not going to perform a guilt he'd felt more acutely than he'd let himself acknowledge, he said, and she appreciated the precision of that, the refusal to over-dramatize the remorse. It had ended because it was hollow, because he had sat across from a woman who required nothing of him and found that requiring nothing looked, from the inside, like meaning nothing. And he had understood, too late, in the way he understood most important things, that Vivian's fighting for their marriage was not embarrassing. It was the most valuable thing anyone had ever done in his proximity, and he had mocked it at a dinner party. He stopped talking. The kitchen was very quiet. She had been watching his face the entire time he spoke. She had watched for the tells she knew, the slight jaw shift that meant he was editing, the way his eyes moved when he was constructing rather than remembering. She had not seen them. She had seen instead the specific discomfort of a person being truthful about something that did not flatter them, which looked different from performance and different from contrition and was its own distinct thing. "Why did Marcus tell me?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Because Marcus has a conscience that operates about 6 months behind events. He felt guilty about the gala. He'd been carrying it. He told me before you did." "Yes." "You were going to tell me." "Yes." "When were you going to tell me?" He looked at her. "I was afraid that if I told you before we had rebuilt any ground, you would leave. And I was afraid that if I waited too long, you would find out another way and I would lose any chance of you believing that I'd intended to tell you at all. So you were calculating the optimal timing for a confession." "Yes." He said it without flinching. "That's what I was doing, and I know what it sounds like, and I'm not asking you to find it acceptable." She thought about that. She thought about a man who had learned to calculate everything as a survival mechanism. in the business, in the world he operated in, where the timing of information was power and the wrong disclosure at the wrong moment was genuinely dangerous, trying to apply that same framework to his marriage and not understanding until now why it kept failing. She did not excuse it. She was not going to excuse it, but she understood its shape, which was different. "I need to ask you something," she said, "and I need you to answer it without calculating what the answer should be." "Okay." "Do you love me?" The question sat between them in the kitchen with the weight of 7 years behind it. He didn't answer immediately. Not because he was calculating, she thought. She was watching his face, and she did not see calculation. She saw a man finding his way to a thing that was true, through the layers of a man who had spent his adult life treating emotional truth as a liability. "Yes," he said, "in the way that I have failed to demonstrate consistently, and in the way that I am only now beginning to understand how to access without being afraid of it. Yes." It was the most complicated yes she had ever received. It was also, she thought, the most honest thing he had said to her in years. She sat with it. Then she said, "I'm not deciding today. I'm not deciding this week. I'm going to keep going to Clarkson on Saturdays. I'm going to keep having lunch with Delia. I'm going to keep eating when I'm hungry and going where I want to go and being the person I've been becoming. And you are going to—" "What? What are you going to do?" He looked at her. "Whatever you'll let me." "That's not specific enough. I'm going to come home before sunset. I'm going to be in this apartment like I live here and not like I'm passing through. I'm going to—" He stopped. "I want to come to the bookstore, if you'll let me. Not to observe, to help. Whatever Ruth needs. Whatever the kids need." She looked at him for a long moment. "You understand that those children are not a backdrop for a reconciliation arc. I know. They're real. Their lives are real. I'm not bringing you in there as a gesture." "I know," he said again, and this time there was something in his voice that was not self-flagellating and not performative, just a plain acknowledgement, the sound of a person who had been told something true and was holding it. She stood up. She took both coffee mugs to the sink. She stood with her back to him for a moment, looking at the window above the sink, at the gray December sky. "You can stay," she said, "in the apartment. I'm not asking you to leave again, but I need you to understand that my staying in this apartment with you is not a decision about the marriage. It's a decision about not being pushed out of my own home." "I understand," he said. "Good," she said. And she turned around and he was looking at her with that open, unguarded thing on his face, and she looked back at him without softening it and without hardening it, and she said, "Don't make me regret it. That's not a threat. It's just true." He nodded. She went to get her coat. She had somewhere to be, but she did not tell Ruth any of it. She arrived at Clarkson and Company at 9:15 on Saturday, 4 days after the conversation in the kitchen, 4 days of Damien moving through the apartment with the careful precision of a man relearning how to occupy space that was not entirely his. And Ruth looked at her face and said nothing, because Ruth was the kind of woman who understood that some things needed to arrive at their own pace. The children arrived in their usual noisy wave. There were 11 of them that morning, more than usual, because word had spread in the way it did in that neighborhood, casually, through school pickup and building stairwells, that the Saturday reading program had a woman who did the voices and remembered what you'd said the week before. She was reading to the older group when Damien arrived. He didn't announce himself. She heard the bell above the door, heard Ruth's brief exchange with someone at the entrance, and then peripherally registered a large, still figure near the back of the room. She did not stop reading. She was in the middle of a chapter, and the children were at the exact quality of attention that should not be interrupted, leaning forward with the particular focus of people for whom the story is, right now, more real than the room. She finished the chapter. She closed the book. "Okay," she said. "What's going to happen next?" 7 children had 7 theories, delivered simultaneously, in the overlapping confident way of people who have not yet learned to doubt their own predictions. She listened to all of them. She argued with 2 of them. A girl named Sophia, 10 years old, architectural in her thinking, said, "The mother is going to do the thing nobody expects because she's been quiet the whole time, and quiet people always have a plan." Vivian looked at her. "I think you might be right about that." She sent the group to the cart to choose their independent reading books, and she stood up, and she looked across the room at Damien. He was standing near a shelf that needed reorganizing. She had been meaning to get to it for 2 weeks, the section for middle readers, which had been restocked without adequate attention to order. And he was looking at the shelf with his hands in his pockets, reading the spines. Ruth was behind the counter doing something with the volunteer schedule. Ruth caught Vivian's eye briefly. Ruth's expression said, "Your call." Vivian walked to where Damien was standing. "The middle reader shelf needs reorganizing," she said. "I noticed," he said. "It goes by author's last name. Ruth's system." "Okay." She handed him the small stack of books that had been sitting on the floor beside the shelf, waiting. He took them. She watched him look at the first one, locate its correct position on the shelf, and slide it in. He did not look at her while he did this. He was paying attention to the books. She went back to her group. He came back the following Saturday. And the one after that. He didn't make it a conversation. He didn't arrive with explanations or apologies, or the particular energy of a man performing effort for an audience of one. He arrived, he found Ruth, he asked what needed doing, and he did it. He was bad at some of it. He had no instinct for the age-appropriate segmentation of the reading groups. He chose books that were too long. He once tried to have a conversation with a 7-year-old about narrative structure that went badly wrong almost immediately. And he did not try to be good at it faster than he actually was. The children took to him with the honest, unsentimental assessment of people who had not yet learned to be diplomatic. Marcus, the 7-year-old with the missing teeth, who had appointed himself a kind of unofficial evaluator of the Saturday volunteers, observed Damien assembling a bookshelf with a critical eye for 2 full minutes before pronouncing, "You're doing it wrong, but at least you're not stopping." Damien looked at him. "Is that a compliment?" "Probably," Marcus said, and went back to his book. Vivian was across the room and pretended she hadn't heard it, because she did not want the expression on her face to be visible. 3 weeks into January, Corbin Voss called the apartment. She answered because Damien was at the bookstore, a Thursday evening errand that Ruth had requested, something about a furniture delivery. And the caller ID said Voss, C, which she had always associated with Geneva and not with Corbin, and she picked up. Corbin Voss was 53, compact and careful in the way of men whose power was structural rather than performed. She had sat across from him at many dinners. She had always found him difficult to read, which she understood now was because he had always been reading her instead. "Vivienne," he said, "I apologize for calling directly. I tried Damien's cell." "He's out," she said. "Can I give him a message?" A pause. "I'd prefer to speak with him directly. There's a situation developing that—" Another pause, different quality. "There are people asking questions about the Falcone operation, federal level. It's been building for 2 months and it's accelerating." The room was very still. "What kind of questions?" she said. Not because she was the right person to be receiving this information, but because the question came out before she could evaluate whether to ask it. "The kind that have subpoenas attached," Corbin said. "There are 3 names on a list that Damien needs to know about. One of them is his." She absorbed that. "And the others?" "Marcus Reyes," he said. "And a financial officer named Harlan Vick." She held the phone. "I'll have Damien call you within the hour." "Thank you," Corbin said. And then, before he hung up, "I'm sorry, Vivian, for what it's worth. All of it." She didn't answer that. She ended the call. She stood in the kitchen for a moment, phone in her hand, looking at the window. Then she called Damien. He picked up on the first ring. She told him what Corbin had said, plainly, without editorializing, the information in the order she'd received it. She heard him process it in the particular silence that was not empty but full of rapid assessment. "I'll be home in 20 minutes, he said. "Okay," she said. He was home in 15. What followed was not the version of events she had imagined, in the abstract, when she had married into the understanding that Damien's life had dangerous edges. She had imagined something cinematic, raised voices, emergency protocols, men in dark cars. What actually happened was quieter and more frightening because it was administrative. Damien sat at the desk in the study with his phone and his laptop and made a series of calls, and she was not in the room for those calls, and she did not try to be. She had understood when she married him that there were rooms in his life that were not hers, and she had made her peace with that, or what she'd thought was peace. She understood now that peace and resignation were not the same thing, But she also understood that there were limits to what she needed to know, and that the calls happening in the study were on the other side of those limits. She made dinner. She sat in the kitchen. She waited. At 9:30, he came out. He sat across from her at the table. He looked like a man who had made several decisions in the past 2 hours, and the decisions had cost something, and he was not going to pretend otherwise. "Tell me what I need to know," she said. He looked at her. "There's an investigation. It's been building since October. Someone inside the organization has been providing information. Someone you trusted." "Yes." "Harlan Vick," she said. He blinked, a fractional thing, the blink of a man who had not expected her to arrive at that conclusion quickly. "We don't know for certain." "You know," she said. "You know, and you're being careful about saying it." He held her gaze. "Yes." "What does this mean for you?" "It means the next 3 months are going to be difficult." His voice was even in the way that meant effort. "It means I need to be very careful about what I do and when and who I speak to. It means some of what I've been building here." He gestured vaguely in the direction of the past several weeks. "The schedule, the bookstore, I may not always be able—" "Stop," she said. He stopped. She looked at him carefully. "Don't use this as a reason to retreat back into unavailability. If that was going to happen, it would have happened before now. You're here or you're not. An investigation doesn't change which one you're choosing to be." He was quiet for a moment. "You're right." "I know I am," she said. "What else?" He told her the rest. Not all of it. There were parts she understood without his saying that she was not equipped to carry, and she appreciated that he understood the distinction. But the relevant architecture of it, the shape of the danger, the timeline he was working with, the choices he had already made in the study in the past 2 hours. She listened. She asked 2 questions, both of which he answered directly. When he was finished, she said, "What do you need from me?" He looked at her like the question surprised him, which it shouldn't have by now, but apparently still did. "Nothing you haven't already been giving," he said. "Just this. The table. You still being here." She looked at him. She thought about what it meant to be here, so specifically, precisely, not in the performed sense, but in the actual one. She thought about Amara at the scholarship dinner saying the pretty ones fall first. She thought about Sophia at the bookstore saying quiet people always have a plan. "I'm here," she said. Not as a promise, not as a concession, just as a fact, which was all she had to offer, and all she was going to offer, and which was, she was learning, enough. The call came on a Tuesday in late January, 9 in the morning. She was at the kitchen table with coffee when Damien's phone rang from the counter where he'd left it while he was in the shower. She did not answer it. She saw the screen light up. Marcus Reyes. And she called toward the hallway. "Your phone." He came out in 30 seconds, towel, wet hair, took the phone. She turned back to her coffee and the book she'd been reading. She heard him say Marcus's name. She heard the quality of his voice change, not dramatically, not in the way of a man receiving catastrophic news, but in the specific way of a man receiving information he had anticipated and hoped would not arrive on this particular morning. She did not look up from her book. He finished the call. He stood in the kitchen for a moment. She could feel him standing there. "They're moving faster than we thought," he said. She looked up. His face was controlled, the control of a man who had been managing the presentation of his own reaction for his entire adult life. But underneath the control, she could see the thing it was controlling, and it was not fear exactly, more the adrenaline-adjacent state of a person who understands that the ground is shifting in a way that requires immediate and perfect footing. "How much faster?" she said. "They want testimony from Vic this week. If he gives them what they think he's going to give them..." He stopped. "I need to meet with my legal team this morning." "Then go," she said. He looked at her. "Vivian." "Go," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." He held her gaze for a moment with something in his face that she recognized now. That open, unguarded thing. And then he moved, efficiently, the way he moved when there was a direction and a decision, and she listened to him get dressed, and listened to him gather his things, and listened to the apartment door. Then she sat alone in the kitchen and finished her coffee, and thought about nothing, and thought about everything, and sat with the specific quality of silence that a person sits with when they have decided to stay, and are learning what staying actually costs and what it gives back. He came home at 11 that night. She was in bed, not asleep, reading. She heard the elevator, heard his footsteps. Different from usual, heavier in a way that was about more than the hour. She heard him move through the apartment. She heard him stop in the hallway outside the bedroom. She did not call out. He opened the door. He stood in the doorway in his coat, looking at her, and she could read his face clearly now in the way she had not been able to read it clearly for years. Not because it had changed, she thought, but because she had stopped caring enough to look. Vic gave them 17 months of transaction records, he said. She set down her book. They have enough for charges, he said. My attorney is filing for a pre-indictment conference tomorrow morning. It's not a certainty, but it's close to one. She looked at him. Come in and close the door. He came in. He sat on the edge of the bed, on his side, not encroaching, not performing comfort. He wasn't sure he had the right to. And he sat with his elbows on his knees and his hands loose between them, looking at the floor. She watched him. She thought about 7 years. She thought about a woman who had been disappearing and a man who had been hiding and the specific damage that two people can do to each other when neither of them knows how to stop. She thought about what it meant to stay, what it actually meant, not in the abstract but in the concrete present tense of right now, this room, this man sitting on the edge of the bed with the weight of everything he had built, legitimately and not, coming down around him. She thought about whether she had decided. She had not intended to decide tonight. She had given herself more time. But the time had a way of collapsing when the moment arrived and required an answer. She moved to the center of the bed. She sat up against the headboard. She said, "Come here." He looked up. She said it again. "Come here. Sit with me." He moved up the bed and sat beside her, not touching, his back against the headboard, looking at the wall across from them. She could feel the heat of him, the particular warmth of a large person sitting close in a cold room. "I haven't forgiven you," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I know. And I'm not deciding tonight what the marriage looks like going forward. I'm not deciding because of an investigation or because you're scared. I'm deciding when I'm ready and on my own terms." "I know," he said. "But I'm not leaving," she said. "Not because you need me to stay, because I'm choosing to. There's a difference, and I need you to understand that difference." He turned his head and looked at her. She could see his jaw working, the particular movement of a man trying to keep his face from doing something he didn't want it to do and failing slightly at the edges. "I understand," he said. "Good," she said. She reached over and turned off the light on her nightstand. The room went dark, lit only by the ambient glow of the city through the curtains. She settled against the headboard and looked at the ceiling. After a moment, she heard his breathing begin to slow. She lay in the dark and thought about the morning and the legal conference and the 17 months of transaction records and everything that was coming toward them. And she thought about the bookstore and Ruth and Marcus, the 7-year-old who had told Damien, "At least you're not stopping." And she thought about a woman who had almost disappeared and had not disappeared and had fought her way back to herself one Saturday morning at a time. She did not know what was coming. She did not know what the next months would require or cost or what would be left on the other side of them. She knew this. She was not afraid of it. She had already survived the thing that should have broken her. She heard Damien's breathing deepen into actual sleep beside her, for the first time in weeks, and she lay with her eyes open in the dark of the room they shared, in the city that kept moving outside the window, and she held the silence, and the silence held her back. The pre-indictment conference was scheduled for 9 in the morning on a Wednesday in early February, and Damien left the apartment at 7:45 with his attorney, a woman named Claire Sato, who was small and precise and had the specific energy of a person who slept 4 hours a night and considered this an advantage. And Vivian stood in the kitchen and watched him go. He had not asked her to come. She had not offered. There were parts of this that were his to carry, and she had made her peace with the shape of that. And she was learning that making peace with something was not the same as being indifferent to it. She was not indifferent. She stood in the kitchen after the door closed and felt the weight of the morning settle into the apartment like weather. And then she made coffee and sat down and opened her book and did not read a single word of it for 40 minutes. At 8:30, she called Ruth. "I'm coming in today," she said. "Not the regular program. Just, I need somewhere to be." Ruth said, "The fiction section needs dusting. Come when you're ready." She was at Clarkson and Cumberty by 9:15, which meant she was in a bookstore dusting shelves while her husband sat in a federal conference room with his attorney being told the shape of what was coming for him. And she found that she could hold both of those facts at once without either of them breaking her. That was new. 6 months ago, she would not have been able to do that. Ruth handed her a cloth without ceremony. She started on the fiction shelves, working left to right, pulling books forward and wiping the wood behind them and pushing them back, which was the kind of work that required just enough attention to quiet the mind and not enough to crowd out whatever needed thinking. She thought about the conversation they'd had the previous evening, not the indictment, not Vic, the other one, the one before the lights went out. She thought about what it meant that she had said come here and meant it, not as a surrender and not as a performance, but as the choice of a woman who had looked at all the available information and made a decision with her eyes open. She had forgiven men for less in her life and called it wisdom. She had not forgiven this yet. She was not going to pretend she had, but she had decided that forgiveness and choice were not the same mechanism, that you could choose a person before you had finished forgiving them, and that this was not weakness but a kind of advanced honesty. The honesty of someone who knows that waiting for the feeling to arrive before making the decision means you will wait a very long time. She dusted the G's and the H's. She straightened a row of I's that had been shelved carelessly. At 11:42, her phone buzzed. Damien. It went okay. Tell you tonight. She read it twice. Then she put her phone in her pocket and moved on to the J's. It went okay meant, as he explained that evening at the kitchen table, that Claire Sato had successfully argued for a narrow scope of proceedings and that the initial charges, 3 counts related to financial structuring, were narrower than they could have been, and that Harlan Vick's testimony, while damaging, was being contested on procedural grounds that had a reasonable probability of limiting its admissibility. It did not mean it was over. It did not mean it was fine. It meant that the next 6 months would be expensive and exhausting and legally complicated in ways that would require Damien to restructure significant parts of Falcone Capital's operations, some of which could be done legitimately and some of which would require a kind of unraveling that he described with the careful imprecision of a man who was not going to give his wife more information than she needed to carry. She let him have that precision. She had made her peace with the rooms she wasn't in. Vic, she said, when he'd finished the overview. Why did he do it? Damien was quiet for a moment. Money. They offered him a reduction on a separate matter he'd been carrying for 3 years. He made a practical decision. Did you know he was carrying something? I knew he had exposure. I didn't know how much. A pause. I should have. She looked at him. What happens to him? Reduced charges. Relocation, probably. He's done in New York. And Marcus? Marcus is clean on the specific charges. He'll have to testify, but his exposure is minimal. He stopped. I know he told you before I did. I know, she said. I'm not holding it against him. He did what he thought was right. Damien looked at her steadily. Even though it blindsided you. I'd rather have been blindsided than kept in the dark for another month. She held his gaze. Wouldn't you? He didn't answer, because the answer was obvious, and he knew it. February was brutal in the specific way of New York Februaries, cold that had lost its novelty and settled into a gray persistent fact, the city moving through it with the resigned efficiency of a place that knew spring was coming, but found no comfort in the knowledge at this distance. Damien's restructuring of Falcone Capital began in the second week of the month. Claire Sato came to the apartment twice, and Vivienne made coffee and excused herself and read in the study with the door shut, and afterward Damien came and sat across from her and told her what he could. She began to understand that restructuring in this context meant dismantling, not the whole of the empire, but the parts of it that could not survive the light being turned on them. It meant withdrawing from certain partnerships, transferring certain accounts, having certain conversations that required both legal counsel and the specific kind of nerve that came from knowing you were relinquishing power you had spent years accumulating. She watched him do it. Not the specific transactions, she was not in those rooms, but the after effects, the way a person carries a decision in their body in the days following it. He was tired in a way she hadn't seen him tired before, a tiredness that was not just physical, but structural, the exhaustion of a man who was actively choosing to be less than he had been, in specific and costly ways, because the alternative was worse. He He did not complain about it. He did not perform stoicism about it either. The performance of stoicism, she had learned, looked different from the real thing, and what she was watching was not performed. I was simply moving through it the way you move through something necessary and difficult, one foot in front of the other, with the specific grace of a man who has finally understood what he is moving toward. He came to Clarkson and Company every Saturday. By the third Saturday of February, Ruth had stopped treating him like a guest and started treating him like a volunteer, which meant she handed him a task list without explanation and expected it to be completed before noon. He completed the task list. He was better with the older children than the younger ones. He had the patience for argument and the willingness to be wrong in front of people that older kids responded to. And Marcus, the 7-year-old, had revised his assessment of him upward incrementally, which Vivian tracked with a private attention she would not have admitted to. One Saturday in late February, she came around a bookshelf and found Damien sitting cross-legged on the floor with 3 children arranged around him, reading aloud from a book she recognized. One of the ones she'd read to the 6 to 8 group 4 months ago, when the program was new to her and she was new to herself. He was not doing those voices. He was reading in his regular voice, which was low and even and apparently sufficient, because the 3 children were utterly still in the way that only happened when the story had them completely. She stood around the corner of the shelf and listened for a moment. Then she went back to her group, because some things did not need to be witnessed to be real. The first full conversation about the marriage. Not a fragment, not a crisis, but an actual sustained conversation about what they were doing and what they wanted and what the shape of things might be, happened on a Sunday evening in early March by accident, the way real conversations usually happened. They had made dinner together, which had begun as a practical arrangement. She was cooking, he appeared in the kitchen, she handed him a task, he did it, and had become, over several weeks, a thing they did on Sunday evenings without planning to. They were not good at it in any culinary sense. They were competent, individually, at assembling separate elements, and the results were edible if occasionally over-seasoned. That evening they were at the table with the results of their combined efforts. Pasta again, better than Vivian's solo attempt months ago, which she did not mention. And they had been talking about something small, something about the bookstore, about a book order Ruth had asked for and whether a certain title was appropriate for the 10 to 12 group, and then the small conversation ran its natural course and there was a silence, and neither of them filled it immediately. And the silence had a different quality than the silences they'd been carrying for years. Not empty, not avoidant, but resting. "I've been thinking about going back to work," she said. He looked at her. "Not the foundation, specifically. Something new." She turned her fork in her hands. "There's a woman in Ruth's network who runs an arts access program for adolescents in 3 boroughs. She's been looking for someone with administrative experience and genuine interest." She paused. "Ruth mentioned my name." "When did this happen?" 3 weeks ago." She looked at him. "I didn't tell you because I wasn't sure how I felt about it yet." He was quiet for a moment. Not the calculating quiet, she could read the difference now. The thinking quiet, the quiet of a man sitting with something and turning it over. "What did you decide?" "I want to meet with her. I want to hear what the work actually is." She set down her fork. "I'm telling you because it will affect my schedule, and because I'm not doing the thing I did before, where I kept parts of my life separate from you because they felt safer that way." "I want you to do it," he said immediately. She looked at him. "Don't just say..." "I'm not just saying it." His voice was even. "I'm saying I want you to have the thing you gave up. I'm saying I understand that the reason you gave it up was in part because of choices I made and situations I created. And I'm saying..." He stopped, started again. "I've spent the last 2 months watching you be fully yourself in that bookstore, and I am not a person who is going to look at that and want less of it for you." She held his gaze. The kitchen was quiet. The city moved outside the window. "I know you mean that," she said carefully. "I'm also aware that meaning it and it being true across time are 2 different things." "Yes," he said. "So I'm going to meet with her, and then I'm going to decide. And if I take the job, I'm going to take it as something that is mine, not something that fits around your schedule or your needs. You understand what I'm saying?" "Yes," he said again. She picked up her fork. She looked at her plate. Then she looked up at him, and she said, "I believe you're trying. I want you to know that I see it." He was very still. I haven't said that before, she said. I should have. You have been showing up, Damien. I'm not going to pretend I haven't noticed. Something moved across his face. Not the edge of tears, she didn't think, but something adjacent to it, something that lived in the same part of a person. He looked down at his plate for a moment. Then he looked up. I have a long way to go, he said. I know, she said. So do I. They finished dinner. They did the dishes in the particular companionable quiet of two people who have arrived, by different and difficult paths, at the same approximate place. Spring arrived in the way. Spring arrived in New York, not as a gift, but as a gradual argument won, inch by inch, against 3 months of gray insistence. The trees on the block where Clarkson and Company stood began doing their preliminary work in late March, the kind of barely there green that required attention to notice. By early April, it was undeniable. The legal proceedings moved through their bureaucratic stages with the grinding slowness that Claire Sato had warned them to expect. There was a preliminary hearing in March that required Damien's presence and produced no resolution. There was a subsequent filing in April that Claire described as favorable on 2 of the 3 counts and ambiguous on the 3rd. There was a mediated settlement conversation in late April that Damien came home from looking like a man who had just moved a large weight from one side of a room to the other. Not lighter, exactly, but differently burdened. The eventual outcome, and this was not a clean outcome, not a vindication, not a story that anyone who loved tidy endings would have found satisfying, was a negotiated settlement on 2 counts, a dismissal of the 3rd on procedural grounds, significant financial penalties, and a mandatory restructuring of Falcone Capital's investment portfolios under independent oversight for 36 months. No incarceration, no further criminal exposure, contingent on compliance. Claire Sato explained the terms at the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening in early May. She was precise and without sentiment, which was what the moment required. Vivian sat at the table and listened and asked 2 questions that were the 2 correct questions, and Claire answered them directly. After Claire left, Damien sat at the table for a long time without speaking. Vivian made tea. She put a cup in front of him. She sat down. 36 months of oversight, he said. Yes. The investment arm is going to look fundamentally different. Yes. He turned his cup in his hands. I've spent 20 years building what it is. I know, she said. He looked at her. I'm not... He stopped. I'm not mourning it. I want to be clear about that. I know what it was and I know what it cost. I know what it cost you specifically. He paused. I'm just sitting with the fact that it's done. She looked at him across the table. She thought about a man who had built an empire from fear and intelligence and a specific refusal to be vulnerable, and she thought about what it cost to choose, at 55, to be something different, and she thought about whether she had any right to ask that of him, and whether it mattered if she had the right. What do you want it to look like, she said. Going forward, Falcone Capital under oversight. What do you want it to actually be? He looked at her like the question surprised him. Not what Claire says it has to be, she said. What you want. He thought about it. A long time. She let him think. Cleaner, he said finally. I want it to be cleaner. Not smaller necessarily, but the partnerships I've been unraveling since February. There are parts of what we built that were legitimate from the beginning. The arts fund investments, the education endowments. He stopped. There's a version of this that I could have built 20 years ago and chose not to because it was slower and less profitable, and I didn't have the patience for it. Do you have the patience for it now? He looked at her. I have different priorities now. She nodded. She drank her tea. The woman you want to meet, he said. The Arts Access Program. I met with her, she said, 2 weeks ago. I was going to tell you when I'd decided. Have you decided? Yes, she said. I'm taking it. He was quiet for a moment. When do you start? First week of June. He nodded. He looked at his tea, and then he said, I want to fund it. The program. Not through you. Through Claire's restructured portfolio arm, clean and documented and independent of you. I want to fund it because it deserves funding, not because you're running it. She looked at him steadily. I'm going to have to think about whether that's appropriate. I know, he said. Take your time. The program director would have to agree. It would have to be transparent. Of course. And if she says no, you accept that. Of course, he said again. She held his gaze for a moment longer. Then she said, I'll ask her. He nodded. She stood up, took both cups to the sink, and stood at the window for a moment looking at the street below, where the trees were fully green now, where people moved in the warm spring evening in the unbothered way of people who did not know or care about the specific weight of the kitchen they were standing beneath. She thought about a night in December, a column wrapped in white orchids, a champagne glass she'd held too tight, and a laugh she'd heard from 12 feet away that had cracked the floor of a life she'd been maintaining by reflex. She thought about everything that had grown in the crack. The cherry trees in Central Park bloomed on a Thursday in mid-May, and she knew because Marcus, the 7-year-old, now 8, who had received a birthday card from both of them, which had been Damien's idea, and which Marcus had received with the assessment of a person for whom cards were fine, but not the point, told her about them with the authority of someone who tracked these things. My mom says they're the best ones, he said. The ones by the water. She's right, Vivian said. You should go see them, he said, and returned to his book. She told Damien that evening. He looked at her for a moment. Saturday, he said, after the bookstore. She thought about it. Okay, she said. They went on Saturday. After the bookstore, after the books were reshelved and the reading groups concluded, and Ruth had locked up and walked home in the direction of her own particular Saturday evening, they walked to the park in the mid-May afternoon with the light going golden at the edges and the city around them doing what it always did, moving, indifferent, alive. And they found the trees by the water. They were everything Marcus's mother had promised, dense and pink and slightly reckless in their blooming, the way trees were when they were doing what they were made for, the petals coming loose in the light wind and moving across the path like something that had decided to travel. She stopped walking. She stood on the path and looked at them, and she felt the particular thing you felt when something beautiful arrived without apology after a long time of weather. Damien stopped beside her. He looked at the trees. They stood there for a while without saying anything. Then he said, I have to tell you something. She looked at him. I've been looking at a building, he said, in Carroll Gardens. It's been vacant for 2 years. It was a community center, closed when the nonprofit lost funding. The structure's sound. He paused. I've been thinking about what you said, about what I want Falcone Capital to actually be. I talked to Claire. The investment in a community arts center, documented and legitimately structured, would fall within the oversight parameters. He stopped. I'm not asking you to be involved. I'm telling you because I'm not keeping things in separate rooms. She looked at him. She thought about a man who had spent 20 years building something in the dark, deliberately, because darkness was faster and more profitable and required less of him. She thought about what it cost to choose to build something in the light, slowly, with independent oversight and documented intentions, and no guarantee of how it would be received. What kind of community arts center, she said. The kind that has reading programs, he said, among other things. She was quiet for a moment. A petal came loose from the nearest tree and moved across the path between them and landed somewhere she couldn't see. You're going to do this whether I say anything about it or not, she said. Yes, he said. I'm telling you because I want you to know. Not because I need your permission, and not because I'm asking you to validate it. Just because, he paused, because it's true. And I'm trying to keep things true between us. She looked at him for a long moment. His face was open in the specific way she had been learning to read over the past months. Not performed openness, not the strategic display of a man calculating how he was landing. Just the actual inside of him, visible, in the way that things became visible when a person stopped being afraid of them. Tell me about the building, she said. He told her. They walked while he talked, slowly, no particular destination, and the cherry blossoms moved around them in the light, and she listened to a man she had loved for 9 years describe a thing he wanted to build that was new, that was real, that was not built from fear. She did not tell him she had forgiven him. She had not entirely. Forgiveness, she had come to understand, was not a destination you arrived at, but a direction you chose to keep walking in. And she was walking in it, and some days it was close, and some days it was further away, and all of those days she was still walking. She did not tell him she was staying. They were past the point where it needed to be said. She was there, she was present, she had chosen this morning, and she would choose tomorrow morning, and the choosing was the thing, not the declaration of it. She did not tell him anything, specifically. She walked beside him under the cherry trees and thought about a bookstore that smelled like paper and wood polish, and about a girl named Amara, who had stood at a microphone and talked about structures that survive stress, and about Sophia, who had said quiet people always have a plan, and she thought about herself. Not the woman who had stood behind a column in December holding a champagne glass too tightly. Not the woman who had written those journals in an apartment that felt like a stage set. But the woman she was now, walking in Maylight, who had rebuilt herself from the ground up and was still building, and had chosen, with full knowledge of the cost, to let the person beside her be part of what she was building. The path curved by the water. The trees were densest here, the reflections of them moving on the surface below. She reached out and found his hand, not reaching for him the way she used to reach, anxious, compensating, trying to close a distance she'd created the fiction of being able to cross. Just her hand finding his, deliberate, unhurried, because she wanted to, and because she had chosen to, and because choosing was what she had. He stilled for half a second. She felt it, the specific stillness of a man who has been handed something he had stopped believing he would receive. Then his hand closed around hers, carefully, the way you hold something you understand the value of. They stood by the water for a while. The petals moved across the surface. The city moved around them. She was not happy in the simple way of a story that resolves cleanly. She was something more complicated and more durable, a woman who knew exactly what she was choosing and why, who had lost things and rebuilt things, and understood that the rebuilt things had a different quality than the original, not lesser, but different, carrying the knowledge of what it had cost to make them. She was not the woman from the gala. She was not the woman from the journals. She was the woman standing here, in the light, holding the hand of a man who was learning how to deserve it, and she had decided that this was enough. Not because she had run out of wanting more, but because she understood now that enough was not a ceiling, it was a foundation, and foundations were what you built from. They walked back through the park as the light changed, as the afternoon tipped toward evening, as the city picked up its Saturday pace around them. They did not talk much. They did not need to. At the park entrance, she stopped walking for a moment. He stopped beside her. She looked at the street ahead, the particular organized chaos of a New York evening, people moving in all directions with their own specific weights and histories and destinations, the city indifferent and alive and not waiting for anyone. "I'm going to be terrible at forgiving you for a while longer," she said. "I know," he said. "And you're going to be imperfect at this," she said. "At all of it. The showing up and the being honest and whatever you're building in Carroll Gardens." "Yes," he said. "And I'm going to be imperfect at trusting you," she said, "and at not defaulting to the old patterns when I'm tired or afraid. I'm going to do that. I want to be honest with you about that." "I know," he said. She looked at him. "I'm telling you because I'm not performing anything. Not anymore. This is the actual version." "I know," he said, for the third time. And this time she heard something in it that was not agreement and not capitulation, but something that lived between them. The specific resonance of two people who had arrived at the same truth by different and damaging roads, and were standing in it together, with clear eyes, without the comfort of pretending it had been anything other than what it was. She turned back to the street. She started walking. He walked beside her. June arrived with heat and the particular smell of a city remembering summer. Vivian started her job the first Monday of the month, in an office in Harlem that was small and slightly chaotic, and run by a woman named Dr. Patricia Okafor, who had the organized ferocity of someone who had been fighting for resources for 20 years and had no patience for anything that did not serve the work. Patricia had agreed to the Falcone Capital funding proposal after 3 weeks of due diligence conducted with the precision of a woman who understood exactly what it meant to accept money from a name like Falcone and exactly what protections she required. The agreement was documented, independent, and gave Patricia full programmatic autonomy. She had shaken Claire Sato's hand with the grip of a person who had read every line of a contract and was satisfied and was letting you know she was satisfied. "Your husband," Patricia said to Vivian on the second day of work, with the directness of a woman who did not circle things, built something complicated. "I'm not naive about that." "Neither am I," Vivian said. Patricia looked at her for a moment. "Good," she said, and handed her a stack of grant applications that needed reviewing by Thursday. Vivian took them. She arrived home that evening with ink on her hands and a clarity in her chest that she recognized as the particular satisfaction of work that mattered, that was hers, that she had walked through difficulty to reach. Damien was in the kitchen. He was cooking, badly, with the focused imprecision of a man who had decided to get better at something and was in the early stages of that project. The kitchen smelled like something that had been left on slightly too high heat. She set down her bag. She looked at the situation. "Move," she said, not unkindly. He moved. She adjusted the heat, assessed the state of the pan, made 2 decisions, implemented them. "How was it?" he said, leaning against the counter. "Good," she said. "Patricia is difficult and exactly right for the work. I have 4 grant applications to review by Thursday. Can I help?" She considered that. "Do you know anything about arts education funding structures?" "I know people who do." "That might be useful," she said. "I'll let you know." She looked at what he'd been attempting. "What were you making?" "I wasn't entirely sure," he admitted. "That's a problem," she said. "I know." She handed him a different pan and told him what to do with it, and he did it. And they made dinner together in the kitchen on the first Monday of June while the city moved outside the window in the summer evening warmth. And it was not romantic, and it was not effortless, and it was not the marriage she had imagined when she was 28, standing in a white dress making promises she'd meant completely. It was something more honest than that. They sat down to eat. The food was adequate. She told him about Patricia. He told her about a conversation with Claire about the Carroll Gardens building, a zoning question that had a straightforward resolution. They talked about the bookstore. Ruth had acquired a new volunteer, a retired school teacher named Howard, who had very strong opinions about the organization of the picture book section, and the resulting territorial situation was apparently complex. She laughed. Not performed laughter, actual laughter, the kind that came from somewhere real. He looked at her when she laughed. Just looked, briefly, the way you look at something you had been afraid of losing and had not lost. She noticed him looking. She let him. After dinner, she cleared the table and he washed the dishes, which was the arrangement that had developed over the past months without either of them deciding it. She stood at the counter with a glass of water and looked at the back of him. This man she had chosen, this man who had failed her in specific and costly ways and was learning, slowly, to be worthy of the choosing. She thought about the column and the orchids and the champagne glass and the laugh that had cracked everything open. She thought about what had grown in the crack, not the marriage she had been trying to preserve, not the illusion she had been maintaining, something raw and structural and honest, built from what had survived when everything else came down. Her own stubbornness, his eventual willingness to stop running, and the specific, unglamorous fact that 2 imperfect people had chosen, repeatedly, to be in the same room. She set her glass down. She went to the window and looked out at the city, which was doing what it always did, indifferent and perpetual and alive. She was 36 years old. She ran an arts access program for adolescents in 3 boroughs. She spent her Saturday mornings in a bookstore that smelled like paper and wood polish and old coffee, where children argued about stories with a conviction she found continuously sustaining. She had a friend named Delia who answered on the second ring. She had rebuilt herself from the inside out in the specific, incremental, unsentimental way that women rebuild things when they decide that what they are building is for themselves. She had chosen to let the man behind her be part of what she was building, not because she had run out of other choices, because she had looked at all of them clearly and chosen this one. The cherry blossoms were gone now, the trees outside just ordinary green in the summer warmth. But she remembered standing under them, and she remembered the exact moment her hand had found his. Not the way it used to reach, anxious and compensating, but deliberate, unhurried, chosen. She turned from the window. Damien had finished the dishes. He was drying his hands on the kitchen towel, and he looked up when she turned, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment because there was nothing left to say that the room didn't already know. She walked past him toward the hallway. She paused at the edge of the kitchen. "Come watch something with me," she said. Not an offer, not a test, just an invitation, plain and specific, from a woman who had learned the difference between reaching and choosing. He hung up the towel. He followed her. The apartment was quiet around them. The city moved outside the windows, as it always moved, as it would always move, unbothered, enormous, full of people carrying their own specific weights through the particular difficulty of being alive and imperfect and still trying. She sat on the couch. He sat beside her, close but not crowding, with the awareness of a man who understood that proximity was something you earned, that space was something you respected, and that both of those things required constant attention and not a single permanent arrival. She reached for the remote. She found something neither of them cared much about, which was exactly right. Outside, the summer night deepened. Inside, two people sat in a room they shared, in the ordinary silence of a life being rebuilt one ordinary evening at a time. And it was not perfect, and it was not finished, and it was not the story either of them had planned to be living. It was the one they had. And she had decided, not once, not dramatically, but repeatedly, daily, in the specific and quiet way of a woman who knew her own mind, that it was enough to begin with.